Good morning, Judge Ashby.
Thank you.
First, I want to thank you for participating in our oral history project. Well, let's get started, as they say, where it began. Where were you born?
Madison, Wisconsin. June 23, 1930.
Ah, and did you grow up there?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Did you have any siblings?
I have one sister who now lives in Denver, and she is almost 82.
What did your parents do?
My father was a barber. My mother had taught school until my sister and I came along, and she was just a housewife at the time.
How long did you stay in Wisconsin?
I left when I graduated my undergrad work at the University of Wisconsin. I finished in 1952. I left to go in the service, and in the meantime, my folks moved to Colorado Springs, so I was there from 30 to 52, 22 years.
Do you remember growing up whether your parents knew any lawyers?
No, you got to understand that was during the Depression. And my folks were never on relief, but as they later put it, because I'm too young to remember the worst of it, but as they later put it, they were hanging on by their fingernails. It was tough. But you know, everybody on the block was in the same place. Nobody had any money.
Well, looking back on it now, from those early days, do you think there's anything from that time that influenced your direction towards law?
Well, I don't know the direction towards law, but my folks made it very clear from the very early age that I was going to university and I was going to be educated and I was going to amount to something. My dad, who worked with his hands, said, "Don't work with your hands, work with your head." And they were very insistent upon that. Of course, my sister graduated from Wisconsin, too.
And your mom was a teacher?
She had been a teacher. You want to hear a little bit about her history?
Yes.
She graduated from high school in rural Wisconsin when she was 16 years old, went to a summer normal school, which were teachers' colleges then, and when she was still 16, started teaching in a one-room schoolhouse in central Wisconsin. She said 2 of her students were older than she was. Them were the days.
Yeah, remarkable woman.
Well, that's the way it was back then.
Now, you said you went to college in Wisconsin.
University of Wisconsin, okay. Madison.
And what was your major?
Economics and political science.
Ooh. Did you go straight through?
Yeah, I did 4 years straight through. Worked 20 hours a week and was on the varsity track team.
What was your event?
400 meters. I wasn't any hotshot, I can assure you, but I did make the mile relay team and got a letter one year.
Congratulations, and that's timely now with the Olympics going on.
Oh yeah, well, they're so much better now than we were, it's ridiculous. And one of the reasons is, of course, their training methods and their equipment and everything is far superior to anything we had.
You said you worked. Where did you work?
Well, I worked as a soda jerk in a drugstore fountain. I worked on the dishwashing machine at the State Student Union. And one year I worked on personnel files at the University Personnel Office.
Kept yourself busy.
Well, my folks couldn't afford to send me. I mean, I stayed at home. Room and board was free. But other than that, I earned every penny of it. This was not unusual. This was very common.
When you were studying economics and political science, where did you think you were going?
My sister's first husband was studying law at Wisconsin, and through his influence, I decided to go to law school. Now, it's interesting how it worked then. If you did all your degree requirements out of the way in 3 years, you could go to law school for your senior year and use the law school credits as electives, which I did.
Oh, that was terrific.
Yeah, you can't do that anymore, I guess. You have to have a degree. But
Well, then, when you graduated, you already had essentially
I had a year of law school.
under your belt. Okay.
Yes, and then I went in the service.
So you didn't go to finish law school
I
yet.
finished law school at the University of Colorado after 2 years in the military because my folks were in Colorado at that time and I could get resident tuition.
Uh-huh.
And I got the Korean War GI Bill plus working 20 hours a week there. I worked for the University of Colorado Library, and I'm the guy that wrote all those Dewey Decimal numbers on the back of books 4 hours a day.
You said you were in the military. Which branch?
Army.
And you said 2 years?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. See, I'd been in ROTC at the University of Wisconsin, so I had a 2-year active duty commitment.
What'd you do in the Army?
Sort of a civilian in uniform. I was in an interesting outfit. The first year or so, I was stationed at Fort Eustis, Virginia. That's the transportation center. And I was in an organization called the Transportation Arctic Group that went to the air base in Thule, Greenland. I was there 5 months. We were doing logistical support for Stanford Research Institute, which had a DOD contract to study overflow transportation out in the Greenland ice cap.
What did you think of that experience?
Great. You understand the sun never went down. And I suppose I shouldn't say this, but they asked what Lieutenant Ashby was doing out on the edge of the ice cap, and he said he had one guy opening beer cans 8 hours a day. But we won't get into that.
Okay. Do you remember any of your military buddies?
Oh, yes. Yes.
Do you keep in touch with any
I
of
keep
them?
in touch with one of them, who, by the way, I went through high school and college with. He lives in New York State. He's a very fine artist and sculptor.
Was he in ROTC with you?
Oh, yeah.
Okay. What do you think now, looking back on that military experience? What do you think of it?
Well, it wasn't for me. I could never have been a career military person, but it's a good experience. It didn't hurt any.
Why couldn't you be a career military person?
I'm too much of a maverick, I think. You got to be an organizational man, and that's just not me. I could never have worked for a large law firm either. Same idea.
Well, when did you come to New Mexico?
Okay, when I got out of law school in 1956, the law firms in Denver were extremely generous in their compensation of juniors, $250 a month. I kid you not. Lawyers were fodder back then. I can tell you my friends at the University of Colorado who were engineers were going out at $500 and $600 a month, and they only had 1 degree. It's a crazy world out there. And so I had a chance to go work for the United States Department of Interior as a lawyer, making $400 a month. Well, I was broke, so guess what? And I worked at the Federal Center in Denver for a year, and they transferred me down here to work for a branch office in Albuquerque for the Interior Department. And I stayed, 56 to 59. I had a chance to go with the State Attorney General's office. I stayed there a year in Santa Fe, came back to Albuquerque and went in private practice with a firm.
Well, let me back up for a minute. I just want to be sure I get this right. You graduated from law school in 1956.
That's correct.
That's from the University of Colorado.
That's correct.
And so your first job out of law school was with the Department of Interior.
That's correct.
Okay. While you were in law school, what did you plan? What were your thoughts in terms of where you were going to go with law?
I was interested in natural resources law, believe it or not, although I never did much of it once I got it.
What was natural resources law to you?
Oil and gas, mineral rights, water rights, that kind of thing.
So it seems like there was some connection with Department of Interior.
Yes, there was. Mm-hmm.
Okay. Would you think had you ever been to New Mexico before you came with the Department of the Interior?
On a train. No, I had a cousin who lived in Long Beach, and I went out to see him and went from Colorado Springs to Long Beach to Los Angeles on the Santa Fe.
Do you remember what you thought of Albuquerque back then?
Nothing. I woke up in the morning and we were at the old Alvarado Hotel.
What kind of law did your brother-in-law practice?
You ever heard of Shepherd Citations?
Oh, yes.
Well, he worked for Shepherd Citations in Colorado Springs. As a matter of fact, when my sister and he were out there with their children, well, that's why my folks moved out there. But anyhow, and then he went in private practice, and he later went to work as an attorney for Superior Oil Company, and well, from then on, it's a pretty sad story. He became a total alcoholic, and my sister finally had it and left him. He died here just a year ago.
Well, you mentioned that he was influential in getting you interested in the law.
Sure.
Did he try to direct you in any direction in the law?
No, but he'd talk about it, and he was in school and everything and discuss it, and it interested me.
What about professors? Did you have any significant professors that you recall?
I had 2 or 3 really great professors in undergraduate work. One guy was teaching ancient and medieval history, and I just fell in love with that stuff. And as you probably know, to this day, I love history. And then I had a political science professor who was terrific too. And there were some others. My almost downfall in undergraduate work was math. I'm a horrible mathematician, but somehow I made it.
Well, I've heard attorneys say to clients sometimes when they ask for something involving numbers, they'll ask the client to come up with the number, and then they add, if I could have done math, I would have been a doctor.
Well, I don't know. No, I never had any interest in medicine, although I have 2 daughters in medicine.
Aha. Did you ever get to do natural resources law?
Some with the Interior Department, yes. Well, and then, of course, I was involved in water rights on a big case that I guess it still isn't settled. The famous Indian water rights case in the Powahki Valley. I represented the Pueblo San Ildefonso on that for years.
As you were going through moving to New Mexico, Department of Interior, and with the Attorney General, did you have an idea that there was a goal in terms of legal practice?
Well, I decided that I didn't want to be part of any government bureaucracy.
That organization thing again?
Yeah, well, and of course the Attorney General's office in those days was highly political. I never would make an opinion or anything based on politics. They could fire me if they wanted to, but I wasn't going to do that. And I could see, that wasn't the way things were. I think it's much different now, by the way. Well, as an example, I got on the job, and they came around and said to me, "We need 2% of your paycheck." What in the devil is that all about? Well, we have a slush fund in the office for parties, and that's 1%. I said, "Oh, I think that's great." He said, "The other 1% goes to the State Democratic Central Committee. And you either paid it or you didn't have a job." Now, that was New Mexico in those days. Okay. That didn't suit me. I stayed a year, and I had a good experience, worked very hard.
Who was governor then?
John Burroughs. The Attorney General was a fellow named Hilton Dixon, who was really a neat guy. He was from Silver City, and he later went to practice in Silver City and became very prominent down there, and he unfortunately died quite young of cancer.
What did you do in the State Attorney General's office? What
Well,
kind of law?
we wrote a lot of opinions, requests from state agencies for opinions, and I also argued probably 2 cases a month in front of the state Supreme Court, representing the state on appeals.
Do you remember who was on the Supreme Court then?
The Chief Justice was J.C. Compton, the judgiest looking judge I ever saw. I mean, he was central casting as a judge. A nice guy. He was from Clovis, and then who else? Dave Carmody was on it. Dave Carmody was a tough cookie and smart from Santa Fe, and then they had Erwin Moise, very famous lawyer from Albuquerque, who I think is the best justice they've ever had up there, maybe before Montgomery and those guys. And I forget who the other 2 were.
Okay. Did you get involved in politics during that time?
Not during that time. I tried to stay out of it. When I came back to Albuquerque and got in private practice, I was in Democratic politics up in the Northeast Heights. I was precinct chairman at one time, believe it or not, which, by the way, helped me later on.
When you say you went...
By the way, they were 70% Republican up there, so we were not very successful. Be that as it may.
When you went into private practice, was that sole practice?
No, I was with a firm, Nick and Sam Dazzo and Bill Brophy.
And what was the name of the firm?
Dazzo and Brophy.
And the Dazzos, tell me about them.
Well, Nick and Sam were brothers, and they came from very poor circumstances. Her father was a coal miner up in Dawson, New Mexico, which is a town which no longer exists. It was a mining camp. It was a company town. And they later moved to Trinidad, Colorado, and they both went to University of Colorado and both became lawyers. Nick stayed in Trinidad, and Sam came to Albuquerque and went with what was known as the Sims firm. Then it was Modrell. It was very small at the time. And Sam was extremely astute in money. He became very, very wealthy. Nick wasn't going to the poorhouse any, but he was never as wealthy as Sam. In fact, when I started with them in 1960, and Sam really never practiced law after that. He played around with his own money. Nick was the head of the firm. Brophy was an interesting guy.
What was his first name?
Bill. Bill Brophy had been prominent in Democratic politics and was prominent nationally in Indian affairs. And he became the Commissioner of Indian Affairs under Harry Truman. But he also was a TB person. And he couldn't last out east. And he came back to Albuquerque, and they set him up in the job as the head Interior Department lawyer in Albuquerque. And he was a very avid Democrat, and when the Eisenhower administration came along, he and his boss in Denver didn't agree on anything, so he left and went in private practice with Sam and Nick. Brilliant guy. Brilliant guy. One of the smartest people I ever know. But you know, he was a fish out of water in private practice. He could have cared less about the business end of it. Nick took care of the business end of it.
Did you know any of these people before you got a job with them?
Oh, yeah, I knew them all. Of course, I knew Brophy. He was my boss when I came down here in the Indian Fair.
And did you know either of the Dazzo brothers at University of Colorado?
Oh, no.
Was that just coincidence that you all came from there?
That's all coincidence, yeah.
Oh. So how big was the firm? Was it just...
4 of us.
Just 4.
Mm-hmm. And then Brophy died a couple of years thereafter. I mean, he had TB, and then he got prostate cancer. Very sick man.
Was he pretty young when he died?
He was, I think, in his late 50s.
Well, that's quite a firm that you were with, because it grew over time.
Well, it's this firm today.
And there's also another judge from this firm besides you.
Stu Rose?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, you see, what happened is Nick and Sam and I were there, and then we were associated with some others, Mark Clayberg and a couple others. Marty Paskine came along. Nick and Sam represented the Acoma Pueblo on his claim against the government under the Indian Claims Act. And in, I think it's 72, it was finally settled for a very substantial sum. And they got a whale of a fee out of it, and then they retired. Well, here I was all by myself with a couple of associates, and I ran into Stu Rose and Bill Scholler, who were also been cast adrift by a guy who retired, so we joined forces, and that's where this firm came from.
What was the name of the firm then?
Ashby, Rose, and Scholler.
So it was three of you.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
What kind of law did you do? Both when you first started and then when it was
Well, when I first started, I did some work for the Indians because of Brophy. He couldn't drive. He was a very, he's a sick guy, so I used to drive him all over the place and represent him. And then I did a lot of real estate work too. Represented a title company and real estate, and just general practice, some personal injury work.
Were these guys your mentors then in learning how to do it?
Nick was really my mentor. This guy knew how to practice law, and he taught me a great deal. And of course, I know you know, Nick died here a few years ago. He's 94 years old, and I'm very fond of Nick. Great guy.
And they were interesting also, weren't they? Wasn't there something with Fat Boy?
Oh, well, Nick, of course, had been with the Manhattan Project as a counterintelligence officer at the Second World War, and he is the guy that drove in a truck the Hiroshima bomb down to Albuquerque for transportation out to the coast. He knew all about it.
There were some great stories then.
Oh, well, he told some marvelous stories.
You remember any?
Not really.
Okay. If you think of them, let me know.
Okay.
When it was just you, Bill Scholler,
And Stu Rose.
and Stu Rose, did the firm have a focus in terms of practice?
Well, I
law?
carried on my business, and Stu came into some business, and we represented some bankruptcy work. I mean, Bill Scholler did a lot of bankruptcy work. Unfortunately, he had a problem. We had to let him go.
And so was the firm two people then? And there were
Well, then Marty Paskine and Mark Dow and some others came in. Myra and Lynch.
Okay.
And, they were there when I finally went on the bench.
Did you ever do any criminal law?
Well, of course, when we first started and we were sworn in federal court, we were required to do 2 years of unpaid representation of indigents. And every Friday we had to go over and get assigned cases. And you get 4 or 5 of them at a crack. And it wasn't like it is today. Discovery was the U.S. attorney would kindly give you the confession. And that's all the discovery you got. So, I don't know how criminal law is today, but it was then. It was basically making deals. Although I did try a couple of cases, and I actually got an acquittal over there, which shocked Judge Rogers.
What was the defendant charged with?
Rape on an Indian reservation. And, of course, I tried the victim.
Well, how did you win?
Well, it was out of the Mescalero Reservation, and I went down there and talked to the law enforcement people down there, and they were very cooperative. And they said, well, this gal is sort of the local tramp. And I went from there. And so we tried the case, and she was on the stand, and I just took after her. And I got to say this, she was honest about it. She practically admitted, yeah, I'm the local tramp. And of course the jury heard that, and that was the end of that one.
So you won.
I look back upon that, you know, it's right out of Perry Mason.
And your other partners, did they do this also, do criminal law?
Well, they were beyond that.
What about divorce? Did you ever do divorce?
Oh, yes, I did divorces. You got to understand, back then you did a general practice. I don't think you could do it anymore. I don't see people doing general practice anymore. They specialize. We didn't specialize nearly as much. I never did a tax matter. I wouldn't get near a tax case or anything like that. But divorce is sure.
And what's the difference? Why do you think people wouldn't do that now?
I think the profession is much more specialized. Well, I think divorces are more difficult. You got all these retirement issues now, you know, coutures and all that stuff. We didn't have that back then. It was who got the children and who got the house and how much alimony and, you know, that kind of thing.
When you were working for the Department of the Interior, do you remember what your salary was? I think you told me $400.
I started at $400 and I ended up at about $500. Yeah, and then when I went with the AG's office, I think I got as high as $700 a month, which, you know, in 1960, that was great. That would be way below the poverty line today.
Yes, yes. Well, before we get to your judicial career, let's talk about your lovely wife. Who is your lovely wife?
Her name is Jane Ashby.
And when did you get married?
December 29th, 1956. So it'll be 52 years this December.
So she was with you along for all of this that you've been talking about.
I met her at the University of Colorado. She's a farm girl from Iowa.
And what was she studying?
Teaching. She was a kindergarten teacher for a while.
And you guys have kids?
I had 4.
And you say you have 2 daughters in medicine.
Well, I had 3 daughters and a son. The son is deceased. I have, my oldest daughter is a nurse practitioner in neonatal intensive care at the University of Colorado Hospital in Denver. My middle daughter is a medical doctor running a family clinic in a little town called Fayetteville, West Virginia. And my youngest daughter has a PhD from Stanford in mechanical engineering, of all things, and she's a full professor of engineering at the United States Naval Academy. I'm very proud of her.
You have quite impressive daughters. Clearly, product of their parents.
Well, let's not get into that. I always told my daughters, look, you're going to have a skill. Not only be educated, but you got to have a saleable skill. Because the days when women were just housewives sitting around helping out their husbands, that's over. And if you want to do it, now if you want to just be a housewife, that's another matter. But if you really want something, for heaven's sakes, get a saleable skill, and they have them.
Indeed. And so they live in interesting places.
Mm-hmm.
What's West Virginia like?
I call it America's third world, but she lives in this town. It's famous for one thing. You've probably heard of the New River Bridge. Well, the New River is the big rafting river out east, and there's this huge bridge that goes across it. Pick up the West Virginia quarter and look at the back. That's the New River Bridge. And they have a day, no kidding, where people jump off this bridge and parasail and bungee jump and all. It's crazy. But Diane, that's her name. The middle daughter is the maverick of the family. She would not come and live in Albuquerque or any city. She just loves it out in this small town. That's great.
So, and the maverick strain continues.
Yeah, I guess from me to her.
When did you become a judge?
1981, May 1st.
How did that come about?
Well, this is interesting, too. I was in the office about February working away, and I got a call from Judge Biamonte, who, by the way, was a law school classmate of mine at Boulder. And he said, "Can you come down and see me? I want to talk to you about something." I said, "What have I done now?" He says, "Nothing. Come on down." So I went down, and he closed the door, and he says, "Judge Maloney is going to retire, and he's under fire." I'm not going to get into that. I know what it was. And he's going to retire, and we're looking for another judge, and I think you ought to go for it, and Jerry Cole thinks you ought to go for it, and I think we can get a lot of support.
Which judgeship are we talking about?
District judge.
Okay.
So I said, "Well, I got to talk to my wife about this," and we talked about it, and Jane and I agreed, and I went for it. And they didn't have the formal committee business then. You know, the Bar Association, the state bar, had a committee, just an ad hoc committee, which would interview people who wanted to be judge. And I interviewed in front of them, and they acted very favorably about it. And then I had to go see the governor, of course, Bruce King. Well, I had been precinct chairman many years before, and that didn't hurt.
Aha.
And he appointed me.
Did you ever have to run?
Yes.
When did you run?
Well, you see, you get appointed till the next general election. You don't get appointed for your full term. So I had to run in 82. Hardest work I ever did in my life.
Well,
I mean, day and night. I don't see how these politicians do it.
yeah, and was it expensive?
I think we raised $25,000.
Oh, my.
Today, that would be pocket change. And I think if there's anything wrong with the American political system is that you have to beg for money to run. I think that's awful.
Do you think that's maybe especially so in judgeships?
Yeah, because let's face it, who's going to give you money? Lawyers. And you try to make it very clear to them that's not going to influence you in making decisions, but, you know, I mean, they're human. These are the people, and we threw a big breakfast over at the Marriott over here, and 300 people showed up, you know, and all of that. Oh, you shake a lot of hands and kiss a lot of babies and act nice to people you can't stand, but I mean, that's the way it is. I only had to do that once, because the next time I ran, to finish out my term, I was unopposed. And then the next time I ran, of course, we had the retention system. So,
well, that first time that people run for judge, you had to put together a campaign committee, didn't you?
Oh, yeah, sure. Uh-huh.
Did you know what you were doing?
I hope so. I won. Well, okay, Mark Dow was my chairman, and he ran it very well. He handled the money and everything. That's one thing you don't want to do. You don't want to handle the money yourself, or you don't want to officially know who's contributing, although, you know, who's getting who. And we were successful. My wife was extremely good at organizing stuff. Well, she's a whale of an organizer, anyhow.
She's one of your assets.
Oh, very definitely.
What do you think of the current method of judicial selection?
Well, it's a hybrid, as we all know. I'm afraid it really hasn't got out of politics like it was supposed to. I think the politicking is done before the committee does its recommendations to the governor. I was all for it, you understand. I can't see where judges should be elected on a partisan basis. Now, there's a lot of people disagree with me, even among the judiciary, but I don't think judges ought to be elected on a partisan basis. But now, of course, officially they aren't, but, well, they are the first time, because, you know, as you well know, you got to run in a partisan election right after you're appointed, and then after that, supposedly, it's nonpartisan. That's just the way I feel about it.
And So you think there's some politicking done just to get your name to come out of that committee?
I think there is. A good friend of mine one time says you can't take politics out of politics. So there you are. You know, even the federal judiciary, when that's strictly on merit, that's nonsense. We all know that there's all sorts of politics involved in that. That's not necessarily bad, but there it is.
When you became a judge, was the Second Judicial District Court divisionalized?
Yeah, well, divisionalized in the sense that you were I was in Division 7. Okay, now, the only split they had then was juvenile. That was separate.
So does that mean you did civil and criminal
and
cases?
Divorce and family and the whole bit. Juvenile was separate. You know, they were out at the juvie center. There was Judge Brown, for whom the building was named, and I forget if there was anybody else out there. The rest of us were down to the old courthouse. There were 15 judges then.
Did you have a preference during your term as judge for civil or criminal cases?
Well, once we split into different divisions, I mean, I shouldn't say.
Well, I guess categories.
Different disciplines. I took civil. I preferred civil. The first split, of course, was when family court was split off from the rest of us. I had, I think, 2 or 3 years of family court.
What did you think of that?
Tough.
How so?
Well, it's awfully hard to see families split up. Now, don't get me wrong. In my opinion, it was absolutely necessary in a number of cases. But it's tough to sit up there and judge people's lives that way. But you got to do it. I mean, somebody has to make a decision, especially with children. It didn't bother me to give somebody the house, hit somebody with alimony. I mean, what you call spousal support now. But decide what happens to children is tough. And of course, you know, that's a two-way street too. There are children who just love to pit one parent against the other. And then, of course, there are parents that like to pit the children against each other. Now, isn't that awful? But that's the way it is.
Do you see any improvement or have any suggestions for improvement?
I think the idea that crept into family court afterwards of having some mediation is a very good idea. I think, however, and I'm not going to mention names, some judges carried it way too far. Because sooner or later, you know, I think a judge has to get on the bench, listen to the evidence, and put their foot down and say, this is it, bam. I think, well, this is not only family court, but I think clients want decisions. Now, they don't want you to be arbitrary, capricious, and unreasonable, but they want you to decide something. Especially business clients, you know. They're in business. They got to have answers. They may not like the answer, but they got to have answers.
So is there something that goes along beforehand that delays getting to the decision part?
Well, I think it depends on the case. Let's face it, most cases aren't hard to decide. It's pretty obvious. I mean, in civil law, you know, A owes B a bunch of money. B's entitled to the money, you give him a judgment. Somebody has committed a fraud, you rule against them. But you get these cases that are really tough, too. And they could go either way, and the best you can do is to study the law and look at the facts and decide it the best you can.
Do any cases come to mind?
Oh, I had a case where the paperwork must have been 3 feet high, and I worked on it, and I finally decided, you know, the paperwork's all well and good, and the law is either way on it, and, you know, I think I think in all fairness, A should win and B should lose, and so I just did it. I got affirmed too, believe it or not.
I was going to ask if you'd been appealed.
Well, you know, here's another thing that I feel. If you're going to worry about being reversed, you're not doing your job. Now, that doesn't mean you go around deliberately trying to get reversed or anything, but you do the best you can on the facts and on the law, and you make a decision. And if the loser doesn't like it, the loser can take it up to the Supreme Court, and they can look at it and decide. And if they disagree with you, okay. Lawyers disagree all the time.
So when the loser's attorney says to you, Judge, I'm going to appeal, what was your reaction?
You need a map to get to Santa Fe? It's only 60 miles. No, it didn't bother me. There's only one case, and I'm not even going to mention it, where I think the Supreme Court did me in for political reasons, and that's the end of that. I'm not going to discuss it.
Well, now you've just intrigued me.
Well, I'm not going to intrigue you any further. It was an important case. I'll tell you later when we're off the record.
Okay. Okay. Who was governor then?
When I was appointed?
During this intriguing case?
Had nothing to do with the governor.
Okay.
And I forget. I think it was Tony Anaya, but it didn't have anything to do with the Anaya administration. It was local politics, let's put it that way.
Well, as a judge, you see a spectrum of parties in cases. That's fair, right?
Mm-hmm.
Do you care to make any comments about parties you've seen in cases that were memorable one way or the other?
Okay, I'll tell you a great one. I handled criminal, for a number of years until they split criminal and civil off, and then I took civil.
Well, actually, you were in judgment of one of my trials. I did a bench trial in front of you.
Your husband tells me a great story that I didn't remember.
We don't have to go there, Judge Ashby.
Not you.
Okay.
He said he had his first case in front of me, and he's arguing, and he produces in front of me a copy of the decision of the Supreme Court. He said, I've got to win. And I looked at it and I said, no, you don't. That's a Tony Scarborough decision, and I don't believe in it. That's Kevin talking. No, I had a criminal case, capital murder. And what it was, this is the guy, his name was David Leon Cheadle, who had murdered the former Lobo basketball player, Gabe Nava.
It's a famous case.
Very famous case, and Judge Stowers heard it. And it resulted in a conviction and a death penalty. On the bifurcated trial, it resulted in a death penalty. The defense team, different lawyers at that time, filed a writ of habeas corpus on the ground of ineffective assistance of counsel. And we had a long hearing on that, and I came to the conclusion that the defense lawyer at the trial, who I will remain nameless, in the death penalty phase, had done a woeful job, really bad. In fact, he did literally nothing. And so I ordered a new penalty phase only. Now, this created a real legal problem because there's nothing in the statutes that provides for this. What do you do? So what I did is I had a new penalty phase trial in front of a new jury. You couldn't reconvene the old jury. In front of a new jury. And what we did is we put on a mini trial of the merits because they had to know what was it all about it. That lasted a couple of days. And then we went into the penalty phase. Well, this guy Cheadle was, he's the worst human being I ever had in front of me. He was awful. But he was street smart. They were bringing him down from the state penitentiary. He greased himself in his cell so it'd be hard to hold on to him. And he got down there, And he had been causing trouble in motions anyhow. This guy was bad news. So he gets there and he starts shouting and screaming before we bring the jury in. And I looked at him and I said, Mr. Cheadle, we are going to have decorum in this court. You know what he told me? Judge, take your decorum and shove it right up your ass. Well, it hadn't been so deadly serious, I'd have fallen over laughing. Well, what was I going to do with this guy? I didn't want to put the cuffs and, shackles on him in the courtroom. Well, my courtroom happened to have a TV booth in the back where, you can watch and see and hear everything. So I put him back there with 2 guards. And then we proceeded with the case. And I told the jury, I said, he's back there because of problems we had. And, of course, I had to recess the case often in order to let his attorneys talk to him. We got a hung jury on that. And so under our statute, it must be unanimous for the death penalty. So he's still up in the pokey in Santa Fe. I understand, having talked to the associate warden years later, that he's pretty much out of it.
Did you get any feedback from the legal community for what you did in this case?
None. The lawyers who handled the case thought I handled it very well. I mean, it was a very unusual situation. How do you do it?
Do you remember who the lawyers were?
Yeah, Ben Gonzalez from the State Public Defender's Office represented Cheadle. He did a beautiful job. And Harry Zimmerman was the Assistant Attorney General, and he did an excellent job. It was well timed. But we had a couple people on that second jury that just weren't going to impose the death sentence. Well, okay, that's their prerogative.
Oftentimes, criminal cases give very interesting stories.
Oh, yeah.
Well, I asked you about parties.
Yeah,
you
we'll
also
get back on the subject matter. Right?
Well, this leads me to attorneys. You see a spectrum of attorneys that come before you.
Yeah, well, I think the attorneys fit a bell curve, like all the rest of the society. They run from superb to awful, and most of them pretty well in between. I've had some superb attorneys appear in front of me.
Care to mention any of them?
Yeah, on medical malpractice cases, Rand Miller, great. And what's his name? The little guy that was with him, who's now on the plaintiff's side, by the way. Greg Chase. Greg Chase, wonderful lawyer. John Tittman, who's now deceased and was with the Kelleher firm, great lawyer. Dick Winterbottom did some criminal defense, excellent. Oh, and Gary Mitchell is great. Gary Mitchell got a hung jury on a capital murder case. It seemed to me it was pretty obvious the guy was guilty as hell. But Gary Mitchell did it. And, the public complained, how can you represent a guy like him? Well, that's their job, and he did a beautiful job, and he was very professional about it. That's what I like. I like lawyers who are professional and not theatrical, let's go to the newspapers about everything. Try cases in the media. I don't like that.
When you were presiding over criminal cases, do you think it was helpful that you had criminal defense experience?
Oh, yes.
And also prosecutorial experience?
I never had any. Well, I had prosecutorial experience at an appellate level, never at the trial level. The hardest part of criminal law, outside of the really tough capital cases and that kind of thing, is sentencing.
What do you mean?
Well, you got people's lives in your hands. And, you get pre-sentence reports and other input, which is very good. I thought the probation officers, by and large, did an excellent job. But here you are. You got somebody in front of you, and you got his or her life in your hands, and you're trying to do the right thing. Now, some of it's easy. There's guys with a rap sheet 2 feet long. Well, you got to put them away. Society demands it. And then you get some dumb person who's stolen 3 hubcaps. Well, you don't send them away if they have no record. But there's those in the middle. What do you do? Do you send them to prison where they get a graduate degree in criminality? Or do you send them out in the streets and hope they don't get in any more trouble? I mean, you know, or you put them in a program that may work and may not. It's tough. But you got to do it. I mean, that's what you're paid for, so do it. And hope you're right.
Well, do you think it was harder being a district judge with the discretion that you had as opposed to federal judges who have to deal with guidelines?
Well, I think it's harder, but I think it's a much fairer system. John Conway one time told me that a trained dog gets sentenced in federal court. Now, the Supreme Court of the United States has changed that. They give them a lot more discretion, as you know. But in those days, I mean, you went by the guidelines, and I'll tell you, the best comment I ever heard on it was now Senior Judge Parker, Jim Parker, who talked to a bar association meeting and said, you know, I suppose there's more uniformity under the guidelines, but you know, criminal defendants aren't fungible, which means they aren't all the same, and you've got to look at the person. Okay, I pontificated. Let's go.
Well, that's excellent. We'll get you on other areas, too. I've asked you about parties and attorneys. What about your colleagues on the bench? Do you have any that you'd like to comment about?
The late Frank Allen was a great, great judge and a great lawyer and the nicest guy in the world. I'm sorry he stayed on the bench too long and then died, 5 months later or something? That's too bad. Great guy. Richard Traub was an excellent judge. Now, he and I don't see eye to eye on a lot of things because I eat lunch with him all the time now, but he was an outstanding judge. Trying to think of others. Back when I first started, I thought Dan McPherson was a wonderful judge. Some of the judges were characters back there. Judge Tackett didn't want to hear cases. He'd call you into chambers, close the door, and he'd settle everything. It's funny because there was one lawyer who was prominent in town who represented the insurance companies, and for some reason he was always on the other side of a personal injury case with me. And if we drew Tackett, I always won because Tackett just hated this guy. And he'd give me a favorable settlement. No, there are other judges over there. Franchini, I like Gene Franchini. He's a little bit of a wild man at times, but he did what he thought was right. Those are the names that come to my attention. And, of course, Biamonte was my classmate, pushed very hard to get me to be judge, and he finally got tired of it and went in the real estate business and built apartments. Rosier Sanchez was a sweet guy. He's still alive, you know. And Rosier, poor Rosier, he was still on the bench. I guess he'd retired when all of the scandal broke about his brother, the ex-archbishop, you know, and it really crushed him. But Rosier's a very nice fellow.
I practiced some criminal cases in front of him also, I remember. Some have said that as a judge, you end up isolated because of avoiding appearance of impropriety. Mm-hmm. Did you feel that when you were a judge?
Somewhat, yeah. You've got to avoid discussing the case with anybody other than the lawyers when they're both present. And you got to be careful about the media. Now, there's one reporter for the Journal. I don't know if you remember her, Burks?
Suzanne.
Suzanne Burks was very, very professional about it. She would come in and ask me about cases, but never about what I was going to do, or she would want to know the procedure because she wanted to report it in the papers correctly, and I was very glad to tell her that, but I never told her what I was going to do or anything, and she never asked. Now, there's another reporter for the other paper then in town who I never told anything to because it was going to get in the papers all screwed up. You go to parties. And, you know, people inevitably were going to ask you about a case. You just had to say no. You know, you can't discuss it.
Do you remember how you used to do pretrial conferences?
Oh, they were a blast.
Talk about that.
Well, one thing I tried to do is always have the client in there, if you could. Now, sometimes you couldn't. But at least a client, or if it's a corporation, a representative. And I wanted to get into the facts. I didn't want terribly interested in the law, and I want to know the facts, because I think cases are fact-oriented anyhow, basically. And then we sit down and try to work it out in a reasonable fashion, you know. Let's set a timeline, and let's see what discovery we're going to do, and, you know, what needs to be done. Anybody got any problems? The reason I had the clients in there is I had the standard speech. Look, you guys, litigation is always four things. It is always expensive, it is always time-consuming, it is always risky, and it's always traumatic. Now, do you want to go through with this? It worked. You get settlements because I think clients understood that, you know, they were running up a big bill and a lot of time and tearing their hair out when something could be taken care of. It didn't always work, of course.
Well, you also did similar things in criminal pretrial conferences.
Yeah,
you
sure.
got the attorneys and
Mm-hmm. Well, they were basically scheduling conferences and scheduling motions. And there was one lawyer who, back in the days when it wasn't as informal as it is now, always showed up in jeans and a cowboy shirt, and I had to tell him, He's from the DA's office. So I talked to Steve Schiff, and I said, Steve, you can run any kind of a dress code you want to in your office, but nobody comes over there looking like that.
What was his response?
Steve was fine. I got to tell you a story. Steve, you know, went to Congress, and the poor guy died from a botched up job of getting rid of the carcinoma. That's another story. But the week that I was leaving the bench, I got a call from Steve Schiff personally in Washington, D.C., thanking me. And he's a Republican. Now, that was nice.
What a gentleman.
He was a gentleman. He was okay.
What cases, if you haven't already said them, do you remember when you were a judge?
On the civil side, I had 3 or 4 really big medical malpractice cases. One of them lasted 7 weeks.
Do you want to stop?
Well, I had a series of medical malpractice cases, and one thing I liked about them was normally the lawyers were excellent lawyers on both sides. And I had one that lasted 7 weeks. It was one of those bad baby cases. The kid came out of the womb with, you know, the tube tied around about 3 times and everything. And the parents, it was a very tragic situation because the parents were poor Hispanic, working people, you know, nice people, and they had this daughter who at that time I think was 6 or 7 years old, and just a vegetable. I mean, really bad. And I don't know how they did this, but they'd hired a lawyer from Fort Lauderdale, Florida, to come in and represent them. This guy was a very well-known medical malpractice plaintiff's lawyer, and he was good. But he made a couple of tactical errors. First is, their name was Gallegos, and he kept referring to them as Gallegos, which may be the way the Caribbean Hispanics pronounce it. I don't know, but anyhow, that went over like a lead balloon with the jury. Well, it went on for 7 weeks, and Rand Miller was on the other side, Rob Lassiter. Well, they sued the doctor, the doctor's partners, Presbyterian Hospital, and the anesthesiologist, which was another mistake. They sued too many people. But anyhow, it went on for 7 weeks, and we ended up with a defense verdict. And The best final argument I ever heard was in that case. Rich Puglisi, you know, who's over as a U.S. magistrate now, he represented the anesthesiologist who I almost summary judgment out of the case, but, you know, if you do that, you're going to get reversed and have to do it all over. So he got up and he said, "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, you've been listening to 2 days of final argument. The Gettysburg Address lasted 2 minutes. I'm not going to take that long. My client should win. Thank you very much," and said on. The jury almost clapped. They loved it. And I did something interesting when that was over, which, believe it or not, I got affirmed on it by the Court of Appeals. The defense came in with a cost bill. Well, they'd won. And it was a couple $100,000, which, by the way, wasn't even close to what the cost would have been to try that. I think there were 60 depositions in that case. I mean, I had a stack of them 3 feet high in front of me. And the plaintiff's lawyer, the local plaintiff's lawyer, Dan Shapiro, came in and said, "I really can't argue about this cost bill. I mean, considering what it was reasonable." He said, "But we're going to have to take bankruptcy." And I thought about it for a minute, and I thought, well, okay, Phil, you're going to stick your neck out on this one. I looked at the proponents of the bill, and I says, "I'm going to deny the entire bill. And I'm going to do it on the grounds that I'm not going to put anybody in bankruptcy to pay Physicians Mutual's cost bill." And I wrote findings on that, and they took an appeal, and I got affirmed. I couldn't believe it. I don't know if it's ever been done before.
Did you ever get any grief from any of the attorneys?
No.
Privately, you didn't?
No. Well, if they went out the door and called me a son of a bitch, I mean, they can do that, but
not to your face?
No. Nobody ever gave me grief on that. I thought it was fair. I thought it was right. I just couldn't see these poor people getting stuck with a judgment for a couple $100,000. I couldn't afford. I mean, couldn't do it.
Well, you were good at that, always finding the human situation.
There was one other one where this black gal who was a sergeant or something out at Kirtland went into a car dealership here in town, and they talked her into renting a car, leasing a car, okay? And they made her put a couple $1,000 down, gave her possession of the car, but said they'd have to take it back if her credit didn't go through. She had the car for something like 3 weeks. Of course her credit didn't go through. And they repossessed it, put it on the lot, sold it, and then sued her for several $1,000s for the deficiency.
And they kept her $2,000.
Oh, of course they did. So they moved for a judgment on the pleadings, and this girl just showed up. Come out of nowhere. She said, "I'm Sergeant so-and-so, and I'm the defendant in this case, and what's this all about?" So I said, "Well, what happened?" And she told me this very story. And I looked at the dealer who was there, and I said, "Is that true?" He said, "Yeah, basically." Well, of course, by this time, my hair was standing on end. And I said, "Well, I'm not going to rule on this judgment now, so you can leave." And then I called her back, and I said, no, I called her back, and then I called him back in after I thought about it, and I said, "I'm going to rule on this case right now on the merits." Everybody, I said, "Mr. Dealer, what is the daily rental rate on this car?" "Oh, X dollars, $40 or something, I know." I said, "Okay, let's say it's $40. I said, "Okay, 3 weeks times $40 is X. You give her back the $2,000 less that, and I'm voiding your whole deal." Oh, they were unhappy. But, I mean, they took this gal to the cleaners, and I just wasn't going to put up with it. Let me tell you, judges do this all the time, and I'm tickled to death they do, because once in a while you got to just do what's right and hope you're right.
Do you ever talk about things like this with your colleague
Oh,
judges?
sure, all the time. Dick Traub told me about the time he denied an extradition because there was some black kid from from Albuquerque who happened to be in Alabama and wrote a check for $75. It bounced. He says, I wasn't going to send that black kid back to Alabama on a deal like that, for heaven's sakes. You know, the governor's extraditing, but
Right.
we're appointed as hearing officers.
Right. Right.
I mean, you just got to do that once in a while. No, you don't do that all the time. You can't. But, okay.
Justice has many guises.
Well, you got to cut some slack once in a while. And if you don't, I don't think you're doing the right job.
When did you retire?
April 30th, 1994.
So how long was your career?
13 years on the bench.
Looking back on it, what'd you think?
Huh?
What do you think about it?
I enjoyed it. I told somebody the other day, I think I was a better judge than I was an advocate. Because an advocate has to go 150% for their client. There were clients I didn't want to go 150% for. But a judge's job is to know the law and to try to do the right thing and be fair. And I enjoyed that more. I'm not going to say I'm God's gift to the fairness, but I thought that was a better place for me than zealous advocacy, as they call it.
Did you ever get any communications from parties who had been before you or attorneys?
Well, I run into attorneys all the time. You know, I have lunch with the boys down at the Hyatt, and there's attorneys down there that I know. But, if I went to a bar association meeting today, I would know nobody. This has been, 14 years since I left.
Well, you were in the bar a long time. What changes did you see?
Well, the bar was small. I think when I first came to Albuquerque, there might have been 200 lawyers in town. That's just a guess, but there weren't many. And in 6 months, you knew them all, or who they were. And you know who to trust and who not to trust, and who was on this side, who was on that side, and who was likable and who wasn't. What are there now? 3,000 lawyers in Albuquerque, 4,000, I don't know. It's a much different animal. And, of course, the bar is much more specialized. You know yourself, Kathy, you don't do all sorts of stuff. You specialize in certain fields, and everybody does. I also think that, how do I put it? Lawyers today are smarter, they're better trained, and they're more intelligent, but they don't have the civility that they used to have.
What makes you say that?
I think there's too many of them, and there's too much competition, and I think it's a reflection of society. I don't think our society is as civil as it used to be. Now, maybe I'm just being nostalgic, and, I think people were nicer to each other back then. I don't know what it is. I think there's a lot more competition today and a lot more confrontation.
Did you see some uncivility amongst lawyers?
When I was on the bench, you bet I did. Not a great deal, but enough to make you have to lower the boom on some of these guys. But I think the lawyers are better prepared. Well, first of all, your research tools are so much better. You got CD-ROMs and law on a disk and all this stuff. You can research the law much quicker and much faster and much more accurate than we could.
What about people skills? Do you see any difference or change?
I just think that on the whole, the Hearth Society, and that includes the bar, more often than not is not as civil as they used to be. That's the only way I can put it. Look at this political campaign. It's nasty as hell.
The national one or the local?
I'm talking about the national one. Of course, Jefferson and Adams almost killed each other, so I guess nothing has changed much. But I don't think people are as civil to each other as they used to be, and I don't like it. But why are people smarter now? Well, there's so much more knowledge out there. When my daughter, who's the professor, got her PhD from Stanford in engineering, she had to write a dissertation. It might have been written in Sanskrit as far as I'm concerned. I had the slightest idea what she was talking. And I have a copy at home, big thick thing, you know. It's tremendous, but I don't know what the hell it's all about.
You mentioned before that special professor you had in medieval history.
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to use that as a jumping off point to talk about your time since retirement. What are your interests now?
Well, okay. I'm a great lover of classical music, always have been. I'm a contributor to the New Mexico Symphony, the Metropolitan Opera, the Santa Fe Opera, and the June Music Festival. So I got a collection of between Broadway and classical music of 300 and some CDs. That's one thing. I've always loved that.
That's a passion of yours, right?
That's a passion of mine. I love to travel. Jane and I love to travel.
Well, you and Jane could write travel guides, couldn't you?
Let me see. We've been to Russia. We've been to Cambodia. We've been to Thailand. We've been to Peru. We've been to the Galapagos Islands. We've been to Kenya and Tanzania. We're going to Egypt in November. We've been to Turkey. We've been all over Western Europe. We've been to New Zealand, and on and on and on.
You guys must be in good health because all that travel takes energy.
We are in good health, and I work out at a gym. Plus, golf is my other passion.
Does Jane golf?
Golf? Yeah, she's better than I am.
Well, she took it up, didn't she?
Yeah, she took it up. She's better than I am. You know what I like about travel? I don't go to travel just to say, isn't that a pretty building? I like to find out what's going on in those countries. Now, that doesn't mean being a tourist, you really know it. But I like to find out what's going on and talk to people and at least get some impression. Well, and I've never been a place where they weren't nice to us. No, we're on tours, you understand. You know, I wouldn't, for instance, we spent 4 weeks in China in 1999. By the way, Beijing is so much different now, I can't believe it watching this TV. But I would never go alone at a place like China. I mean, I'd be lost.
So when you see Beijing now on the Olympics,
it's a different city. Still as polluted as it was. Oh my God, that place is polluted. The Chinese cities are awfully polluted. Well, that's just one example.
In talking with you, it sounds like you have also some passions in politics and reading.
Yeah, I love to read. I try to follow the political scene closely. I have some very strong opinions on it, but I've never voted a straight ticket in my life.
Well, would you care to share some of your observations or thinking on the political scene?
Bush is an idiot. You want any more? And I think campaigning is, let's get to the issues for heaven's sakes. Quit this business of attack ads calling the other guy no good blankety blank. You know, come on.
But there's also a lot of talk about getting to know the candidate, which is a separate inquiry than the issues. What do you think of that?
I think that's important. But let's be fair about it. See, I'll tell you one of my gripes. The good old days of Walter Cronkite and Huntley and Brinkley, these people in the media tried to tell it fairly. The whole thing is so partisan now. You know, you listen to Bill O'Reilly and then you turn around and listen to Keith Olbermann, and all they're doing is hating each other's guts. Now, am I going to get anything out of that? You know what I'm talking about?
Yeah.
Jim Lair has the only one that I think it's fair. So be it, you know.
Let me ask you before I get to maybe what I might call reflections. After you retired, you continued in the law for a while.
I did some mediation and arbitration, yes.
What did you think about that?
I think it's an excellent idea if the parties come in good faith.
Talk to me about that.
Well, I had a saying when I left mediation was that I was sick and tired of greedy plaintiffs and chicken insurance companies. Okay. Now that's an overstatement. But I did run into situations where some of the plaintiff bar on personal injury suits were really interested in seeing how much money they could get so they could brag about it and not trying to get a reasonable settlement and getting on with it. The same thing can be said about some insurance companies, one in particular. I didn't think they were in good faith. They just came in to try to browbeat people. On the other hand, there was a lot of excellent mediation that I handled. You know, lawyers that really, parties that really wanted to get the doggone thing settled in a fair way and get on with it, which is the idea.
Any cases amongst that group in the arbitration mediation area of your practice that are memorable?
I don't remember the names, but there were a couple of medical malpractice cases which took quite a while to mediate, but we got it done, and I think fairly.
What do you consider a significant contribution, whether personal or legal, that you've made?
I think I tried to set a high standard for the bench.
You were outstanding judge by the Bar Association.
People have told me that. I hope I was. You know something, though, this is interesting, and this is just an aside. I'm sure that when I was on the bench, the older lawyers said, these guys aren't as good as old McManus and McPherson and Tackett were. They were real judges. Okay. I hear the same thing today. You guys were good, but these guys now, I don't buy that.
What do you mean?
I think the bench is just as good now as they were when I was there, and we were just as good as our predecessors. Come on. I may be wrong, but I mean, there's a feeling, you know, that, you young guys, I don't buy that.
Couldn't this be just more of your modesty?
Oh, come on, I'm not modest. I think I did a damn good job as a judge, but I think there's people over there now that are doing damn good judges. I mean, come on.
Well, let me go to a different aspect in terms of your experience in the law, whether law school, practicing attorney, and a judge. Women in the law.
Great.
Talk to me.
I mean, you gals are good.
There
are women lawyers who are scum. I mean, you know, there's a bell curve out there. But I think most of the women lawyers I've run into are excellent. When I went to law school, there were no women in our class, none. In the class before at Boulder, there was one gal who was the daughter of a prominent Denver lawyer. Nobody. Now, of course, what is roughly 50%?
Yes, I think so.
Most of you gals, I think, are great.
You think it took some time for males to get used?
Oh, heavens, yes. Heavens, yes, of course. I mean, to this day, I think there's some of those guys out there that, why don't they stay home and take care of their kids, Well, my daughter, who's the professor, has two children, my only two grandchildren, and she and her husband, who's a pilot for United Airlines, manage it very well. But it requires him to do things in the house too. The old days when the guy can sit back and with his buddies in the living room and smoke cigars while the women do all the work, that's over with, in my opinion, and should be. I think the women in the professions is a great thing. Now, that doesn't mean that there aren't some problems about raising families at times, but I think it's great. I'm all for it.
Do you have any words of wisdom for young lawyers?
Well, be professional and be honest. When I was presiding judge, we had them sit down with the young lawyers coming out of UNM, and give them the great words of wisdom. And I think they expected some great legal jewel. You know what I told them?
What?
You come over here, you be nice to the help and never lie to a judge.
Would that were so.
Well, I mean, they're very practical. I know some older lawyers, again, names will not be mentioned, who would lie through their teeth to a judge about fact situations. But you know something? Judges catch on. And I'll tell you how I felt. Once a guy did that to me, and I found out that he was lying, I never believed him again. So, as a practical matter, if you want to win motions, and other things where you're reciting facts to a judge, tell the truth. Be perfectly honest about it.
Do judges share this information with each other?
Oh, yes, of course. There's a grapevine out there. We know who they are.
Do you have any words of wisdom for not so young lawyers?
Don't lord it over the youngsters. I've seen some of that. I don't think it's as much now as it used to be, but I can remember when you were just a, not dry behind the ears young lawyer. Some of the older guys would really try to take advantage of it. They'd try to intimidate you. I don't see it. Well, of course, I've been out of the game now for a few years, but I think it's better now.
What about words of advice for judges?
Listen and rule. You know what I mean? Listen to the parties. Listen what they have to say. Take it seriously, but don't sit on something and take it under advisement till the end of the Christian era, for heaven's sakes. Decide it.
If you had it to do all over again, would you change anything?
I'd like to have been a judge longer. I would never have gone with a big firm. That's just me now. There's nothing wrong with this. There's some outstanding lawyers in the big firms and good friends of mine, but it wasn't me.
So would you take...
I'm glad I stayed in a small group where we were on a first-name basis. I would have liked to have been a judge longer. I should have started sooner.
Started sooner?
See, I was 50 years old when I became a judge, almost 51. I would have liked to have been a judge maybe at 45 or early 40s.
So you'd put it on the beginning of the term, not at the end? How would you like to be remembered?
As being a judge who was fair as hell. Whether I was or not, that's for other people to decide, but that was my goal.
And I would think that there would be many who would attest to that.
Well, I hope so.
Are there any other aspects of your life or career that you'd like to share with us?
One thing I did was to try to take 3 weeks a year vacation with the family. Now, I know lawyers who brag about the fact that they never took a vacation. I think that's insane. You got to get away from it once in a while. And the family is important. And we've had our problem. You know about my tragedy with my son. And but it's important.
Kind of reinvigorate.
I told Kevin this the other day. For heaven's sakes, Kevin, get away from this for a while. Do you good. And, you got to come back fresh once in a while. I never regret having been a lawyer. Would I have been better at something else? Who knows? Come on. I could never have been a law professor, oh good Lord. Stand up in front of these.
Well, let me ask you, did you ever have thoughts of being a different kind of judge, like an appellate judge?
Not really. I'll tell you, I liked the action. I liked being where the action was. I don't know what being an appellate judge is like. I have a feeling it gets a little bit monastic. Oh. And maybe not. I'm sure that Gene Franchini was never monastic. On the other hand, I knew guys that were. I think, what's his name, person you mentioned, the guy from Santa Fe. Montgomery. I think he tended to be monastic. His opinions were very, very erudite. Way too long, but that's another story. I don't think I could have taken that. I mean, that isn't me. Nothing wrong with that. It just wasn't me. Well, oh, by the way, I could never be at Metro. That's a zoo, good heavens. That's not a court, that's a zoo. I think. I shouldn't say that. That's not good. So it's an important court. I mean, a very important court, because that's where most people meet the courts. But I would go nuts listening to DWI cases one right after the other. Or handling landlord-tenant disputes, good Lord.
So district court was great for you.
I loved it. And I liked the civil better than the criminal. Well, as I told you, sentencing was tough. I liked the civil better than the criminal because, by and large, there was more intellectualism in it. And you dealt with some real intellectual cases where, criminal law, except for the really big ones, you could do in your sleep. That doesn't mean it isn't important. It's damned important, but, okay.
Well, Judge Ashby, I'd like to thank you very much for sharing with us, and we would do well to learn from you.
Oh, I hope I've taught something. I don't know. There's some awfully funny things happening in court I haven't talked about. I got to tell you one story.
Great.
I got some I've told you before I'm not going to tell. I had a civil case which was a will contest. And by the way, they're worse than divorces. Estate fights are awful. Because, daddy dies, everybody dresses in black, they go to the funeral, they cry about poor old daddy, then they read the will and all hell breaks loose. But this one guy, an Italian heritage guy here in Albuquerque who everybody who knows him said he was a real character. He drew up a will. Well, that wasn't the will in contest, because after his wife died, he had a mistress and he lived with her for 20-some years, and he died at 90. And the big fight at that time was over the second will, where he gave almost everything to his mistress. And the family was mad. Anyhow, the lawyer who drew the first will was on the stand. And somebody asked a question about what the first will was. And the first will said, I give to my daughter Lena 1 wheelbarrow worth $16.95. I remember the amount exactly. And all the rest, residue and remainder of my estate, wherever situated, blah, 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 I give to my other children. I'm listening to this. And when the lawyer got done, he said, don't step down, please. I can't help it. I've got to ask you why that provision in the will. And he looked back at me and he said, Johnny told me, so that was put in so she could carry away all the shit she'd given to him during her lifetime, his lifetime. I rolled off the bench. It was the funniest thing ever. I told this later to some friends of his that I knew, and they said, yeah, that was Johnny, all right. Okay, I'll stop.
Judge Ashby, it also appears that you had some fun on the bench.
I enjoyed it. Yeah, I had fun. Of course, I had times when... Oh, one other. I was afflicted for a while with some hypoglycemia. And I went to lunch and ate a great big carrot cake. Came back, and a half an hour into this thoroughly dull trial, I fell asleep on the bench. And the next thing I remember, the lawyers are standing at the bench saying, would you rule on our objection? And I said, what objection? And the jury's sitting over there cracking up. I had to recess and apologize to the jury.
One would have thought that we would have heard that story. I've never heard that.
Well, yeah. So, there are times when you're not doing it right. Okay, is that it?
That's it. Thank you so much.
Thanks, everybody.